Right now, millions of people are walking into theaters for a movie that cost $250 million to make. Christopher Nolan shot it entirely on 70mm film, using over 2 million feet of it, the most ever used for a single production in history. It's called the Odyssey, and critics who saw it early are already calling it his biggest film ever, bigger than the ones with the rotating hallways and the reversed bullets. But here's what almost nobody standing in that ticket line realizes. The story is nearly 3,000 years old. It was never written down by the person who told it, and the ending everyone thinks they already know is only half the actual story. There are two epics here, not one, and most people alive today have never even heard the first half. That first half is called the Iliad. The second is the Odyssey. Together, they cover one war and one impossibly long trip home from it, and they are the reason almost every story you've ever loved exists in the shape it does. The reluctant hero forced into a fight he didn't choose. The loyal partner waiting years for someone to come home. The monster hiding in a cave. The trick that wins the unwinnable war. All of it traces back to these two poems, composed roughly 2,800 years ago and recited from memory long before that. You already know fragments of this story without realizing where they came from. By the end of the next 30 minutes, you'll know exactly where the movie starts, what it deliberately leaves out, and one archaeological detail that makes this ancient story unsettling in a completely different way than any myth is supposed to be. Here's why this matters more than a single movie release. For centuries, serious historians assumed the Trojan War was pure invention, a folk tale with no basis in fact whatsoever, the ancient equivalent of a superhero origin story. Then, in 1871, a wealthy and somewhat obsessive German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann traveled to a windswept hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik and started digging with his own money, against the advice of professional archaeologists. What he found didn't just support the old legend. It complicated everything historians thought they understood about where myth ends and memory begins. We'll get to exactly what was buried under that hill. But first, you need the full story he was chasing, because Nolan's movie only shows you one half of it, the second half, the long journey home. The war itself, 10 brutal years that came before that journey, is told in a completely different poem that most people going to see this film have never actually read. So let's set the scene properly, from the very beginning, the way it actually happened in the story. A Trojan prince named Paris was asked to judge a beauty contest between three goddesses, a job no mortal should ever be handed, and the winning goddess promised him the most beautiful woman alive as his reward. That woman was Helen, and she was already married to a Greek king named Menelaus. Paris took her back to Troy anyway, whether by seduction or outright kidnapping, depending on which ancient version you read. And Menelaus called in every favor owed to him by every Greek kingdom bound by an old oath. 1,000 ships reportedly crossed the Aegean Sea in response. The siege of Troy began. It would drag on for 10 full years. And the poem that tells this part of the story, the Iliad, doesn't even cover the whole decade of fighting. It covers just a few weeks near the very end. The exact weeks when the entire Greek alliance nearly collapsed from the inside, over something that had nothing to do with Troy at all. Homer, if a single person named Homer ever really existed at all, likely composed it centuries after any real siege would have happened, drawing on generations of oral poets who had already been reciting fragments of this same story from memory around campfires long before it was ever written down on anything. Those few weeks begin with a fight that has nothing to do with Troy at all. The greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, nearly unkillable in battle, gets into a dispute with the commander of the entire army, Agamemnon, over a captured woman taken as a war prize during a raid. Agamemnon, forced to give up his own prize for unrelated reasons, pulls rank and simply takes Achilles' prize for himself instead. Achilles is so insulted by this public humiliation that he does something that should sound familiar to anyone who has ever quit a job out of pure spite rather than practical necessity. He refuses to fight. Not for a day. Not for a week. He sits out of the war entirely, pulls his own soldiers out of the fighting with him, and simply watches while the men who mocked him keep dying on the beach outside Troy's walls, one battle at a time. Achilles agrees, but on one condition. Scare the Trojans back from the ships, then stop immediately. Don't push toward the actual city walls under any circumstances. Patroclus ignores that instruction completely the moment battle starts going his way. Wearing Achilles' unmistakable armor, mistaken for Achilles himself by terrified Trojan soldiers who scatter at the sight of it, he pushes all the way to the gates of Troy. Hector kills him there, believing right up until the very last second that he has just killed the single greatest warrior in the entire Greek army. He strips the armor off the body as a trophy of war, completely unaware of the fury he has just personally guaranteed for himself. Because when Achilles learns his closest friend is dead, wearing his own armor, killed by the enemy's greatest fighter, something in him breaks completely and permanently, and the rage that follows becomes one of the most famous single emotions in all of Western literature. Ancient readers didn't even call this poem a war story. They called it the Wrath of Achilles. That exact word, wrath, is the very first word of the entire epic in the original Greek text. Achilles doesn't grieve quietly, the way you might expect from a disciplined military commander. He refuses to eat for days. He drags himself through ash and dirt in open mourning, in full view of his own soldiers. Then he asks the gods for brand new armor, forged that same night by a divine blacksmith working through the darkness, and walks back onto the battlefield completely alone, killing Trojan soldiers by the dozens without pause, choking a nearby river with so many bodies that the river itself, in the poem's own telling, physically rises up out of its banks and tries to drown him out of sheer disgust at what he's doing. This is not subtle storytelling by any modern standard. It's grief and rage rendered directly as landscape. And every line of it is building toward one single confrontation the entire poem has been walking toward since its very first page. Achilles versus Hector. One against one. Outside the walls of Troy. In full view of both exhausted armies. When the moment finally comes, Hector, the reasonable one of the whole story, the family man, the prince who has spent this entire 10-year war trying his best to protect his city and his people, panics at the sight of Achilles and simply runs. Achilles chases him 3 full laps around the entire walls of Troy, in front of both armies and everyone watching from the ramparts, before the gods intervene directly and force Hector to finally stop and stand his ground. He loses the fight. Achilles kills him, then does something that shocks even his own hardened soldiers watching nearby. He ties Hector's lifeless body to the back of his chariot by the ankles and drags it in circles around the city walls, in plain, deliberate view of Hector's own wife and elderly father, for 11 straight days, without stopping. It's the kind of detail modern war journalism would call a war crime, and the poem doesn't excuse it or explain it away. It simply shows you exactly what unmanaged grief can turn a person into. Even a person the whole story has spent this long treating as its actual hero. This is where the poem does something almost nobody expects from a 3,000-year-old war epic that's famous for exactly this kind of brutality. It doesn't end with a triumphant battle, or a victory speech, or a city falling. It ends with an old man. Hector's father, King Priam, sneaks alone into the enemy camp at night, completely undefended, kneels down in front of Achilles, the very man who killed and then publicly humiliated his son's body, and kisses the hand that did it, begging simply and quietly for the body back, so he can finally bury his son properly, according to his own customs. Achilles, who has been mid-rage for essentially the entire poem up to this exact point, breaks down completely and cries with him. Two enemies from opposite sides of a war, neither of them personally chose, grieving together in the same tent, over two entirely different losses. That, genuinely and literally, is how the Iliad ends. No wooden horse, no burning city. Just two grieving men and a returned body. The most famous war story in Western literature stops before the war itself is even technically over, before the single most iconic scene in the entire myth even happens on the page. But what nobody expected is that the wooden horse, the trick everyone on Earth associates with the word Troy, the exact twist every person currently watching Nolan's trailer is expecting to see recreated in 70mm detail, doesn't appear anywhere inside the Iliad at all. It shows up centuries later, in other poems, by other authors, in a long relay of storytellers, filling in exactly what Homer chose to leave out. So who actually tells the rest of it? Later Greek and Roman writers pieced the ending together over hundreds of years, and the version most people know today goes roughly like this. After 10 full years of exhausting stalemate, the Greeks secretly build a massive hollow wooden horse, hide their best remaining soldiers inside its belly, and pretend to sail away in total defeat, leaving the horse behind on the beach as a supposed peace offering to the gods. A Trojan priest named Laocoon immediately warns the entire city not to trust the gift, and is killed by two giant sea serpents moments later in front of everyone, a death so visually dramatic that later Roman sculptors carved the exact scene into marble that still exists today. Troy, ignoring every single warning, drags the horse triumphantly through its own walls as a war trophy. That same night, while the entire city celebrates what it genuinely believes is the joyful end of a 10-year war, the hidden soldiers quietly climb out of the horse's belly and open the main gates from the inside. The Greek fleet, which never actually left, sails back under total cover of darkness. Troy burns to the ground in a single night, after standing firm through 10 full years of open siege warfare. One woman, a Trojan princess named Cassandra, saw every bit of this coming the entire time. She had been given the genuine gift of true prophecy by a god, and a cruel curse alongside it as punishment for refusing his advances. Nobody would ever believe a single word she said, no matter how urgently or how correctly she said it. She warned her own family about the horse. She warned them about the coming fire. Every single one of her warnings was calmly, completely ignored. The aftermath is brutal, and none of the surviving poems really soften it for the reader. Priam, the same old king who once knelt and kissed Achilles' hand, is killed right at his own household altar while praying. The city's men are killed outright. Its women are taken as spoils of war. Its walls, which had stood for a decade of siege, are torn down stone by stone until nothing usable remains standing. Of the Greek heroes who technically survived the war itself, almost none of them get a peaceful ending back home either. Agamemnon, the commander whose decision to take Achilles' prize started this entire chain reaction, sails home only to be murdered in his own bathtub by his own wife, who had spent all 10 years of his absence quietly planning her revenge for a completely separate betrayal from years earlier. Even winning in this story almost never actually looks like winning by the time the credits would roll, and one hero doesn't come home at all, not for another 10 full years after the war technically ends. That hero is Odysseus, the clever one, the man widely credited in later tradition with inventing the wooden horse trick in the very first place. His personal punishment for that cleverness, for angering exactly the wrong god along the way home, is a 10-year detour that turns what should have been a routine 2-week sea voyage into one of the strangest travel stories ever recorded by anyone, anywhere. This, right here, is where Nolan's movie actually begins. Not at the war itself, at the trip home that should have taken weeks and instead swallowed an entire decade. But what nobody expected is that the war itself, 10 brutal years of fighting outside a foreign city, wasn't even the hardest part of this entire story for its supposed winner. Getting home turned out to be dramatically worse. According to the ancient accounts, Odysseus left the smoking ruins of Troy with 12 full ships and roughly 600 men under his direct command. By the time this specific journey finally ends, 10 long years later, only one of those 12 ships ever makes it back to open water near home. And standing on that one surviving ship, only a single man remains, Odysseus himself, completely alone. The trip starts small, almost unremarkably. A raid on a coastal town goes badly wrong and costs him men before the real trouble even begins in earnest. Then a violent storm blows his entire fleet completely off its intended course, into unfamiliar water far from any known trade route, and the real story finally starts. Their first major stop, an island run by a one-eyed giant named Polyphemus, a Cyclops, who traps Odysseus and a dozen of his men inside his cave with a boulder no human could ever move, and eats several of them for dinner, one man at a time, over several increasingly horrifying nights. To escape, Odysseus gets the giant deliberately drunk on wine, blinds his single eye with a sharpened wooden stake while he sleeps off the alcohol, and tells him beforehand that his name is Nobody, so that when the giant screams in pain for help, his neighbors outside hear him shouting that nobody is attacking him, shrug, and simply walk away without helping. It's a genuinely brilliant escape plan, executed almost perfectly. It's also, in hindsight, the single worst decision of Odysseus's entire life, because as his ship finally pulls away to safety across open water, he simply cannot resist shouting his real name back at the wounded giant, purely to take personal credit for the trick he'd just pulled off. That giant's father, as it happens, is Poseidon, god of the sea, which is precisely the one god you do not want personally furious at you while you're trying to sail an entire ocean home. From this exact point forward, every single setback on the rest of the journey has one very specific, very personal, very traceable source. The disasters pile up fast after that point. A sealed leather bag containing every single unfavorable wind on Earth, gifted to Odysseus personally by a wind god specifically to guarantee safe passage home, gets opened by curious crewmen who assume it's secretly full of stolen treasure, instantly blowing the entire fleet back to exactly where they started, within actual visible sight of their home island's coastline. A stop among a tribe of giant cannibals then destroys 11 of his remaining 12 ships in a single afternoon, crushed flat by boulders hurled down from cliffs directly above the harbor. By this point in the journey, Odysseus has already lost almost his entire original crew of 600 men, and he genuinely hasn't even reached the strangest, most famous parts of the story yet. Every single one of these disasters, notably, is at least partly self-inflicted, caused by curiosity, greed, or impatience among his own men, not purely by bad luck or an angry god acting alone. Next comes a witch named Circe, who casually turns half his remaining men into literal pigs with a single touch of her wand, and Odysseus only avoids the exact same fate because a messenger god warns him in advance and personally hands him a magical protective herb. He ends up staying on her island for a full year afterward, entirely willingly, comfortable and well-fed, before his own increasingly impatient crew has to remind him they're technically still supposed to be sailing home. Then comes a detour that nobody expects inside what's supposed to be an adventure story. A full trip down into the underworld itself to speak directly with the spirits of the dead, including the ghost of his own mother, who it turns out died quietly of grief while endlessly waiting for him to come home. After that comes the Sirens, mythical creatures whose singing voice is so irresistible that every sailor who hears it steers straight toward the rocks and drowns without any ability to stop himself. Odysseus badly wants to hear the legendary song and still survive it, so he has his entire crew plug their own ears tightly with beeswax, then has them tie him personally to the ship's own mast, with strict standing orders to completely ignore anything he says or begs once the singing actually starts. The plan works exactly as intended. He hears a song no living man has ever survived hearing before, screaming and struggling to be untied the entire time it plays, and lives to describe it afterward, the only person in the entire story who ever does. Then comes a narrow strait guarded by a monster stationed on each side. Scylla, a six-headed creature that snatches sailors straight off a ship's deck as it passes underneath. And Charybdis, an enormous whirlpool that swallows entire ships whole without warning. There is genuinely no safe way through without losing something valuable. Odysseus deliberately chooses to sail closer to Scylla's side on purpose, knowingly accepting the deaths of exactly 6 men, 1 man per monstrous head, because losing 6 sailors is mathematically better than losing the entire ship and crew to the whirlpool instead. It's the objectively correct decision by the story's own blunt internal logic. It is also one more piece of his original crew he personally has to watch die, directly because of a choice he made himself, with full knowledge of the cost. By the time Odysseus is finally the only one left, stranded for 7 straight years afterward on the private island of a goddess named Calypso, who genuinely wants to keep him there forever as her companion, he has lost literally every single man who originally sailed with him out of the ruins of Troy. But what nobody expected is that the version of Odysseus, who eventually washes up, alone, half-drowned, and utterly exhausted, on one final unfamiliar shore, is barely recognizable as the same confident schemer who once tricked a Cyclops with nothing but a fake name and a clever escape plan. 20 full years after first leaving home for the war, he doesn't even recognize the sound of his own name anymore, spoken out loud by strangers who don't know who he is. Back home, on the small island of Ithaca, things have gotten just as bad in a completely different way. Odysseus has been gone so long that nearly everyone assumes he's dead, and over 100 entitled suitors have moved directly into his own palace, uninvited, eating his stored food, drinking his wine cellar dry, and aggressively pressuring his wife Penelope to finally remarry one of them and hand over his entire kingdom in the process. Penelope has spent years quietly stalling all of them with one now famous trick. She publicly promises to choose a new husband the moment she finishes weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, then secretly unravels every single night's careful work in private, keeping the exact same piece of cloth permanently unfinished for years on end. It's one of the oldest documented delay tactics in Western storytelling, and it works for roughly 3 full years before one of her own household servants finally gives away the secret. When Odysseus finally does reach Ithaca, disguised deliberately as an old beggar by the goddess Athena, so that literally nobody recognizes him on sight, even his own wife of 20 years walks right past him in the courtyard without a single flicker of recognition. Only one living creature in the entire palace grounds instantly knows exactly who he actually is: his old hunting dog, Argos, now ancient, flea-ridden, and lying forgotten on a pile of manure near the gate, who weakly lifts his head, recognizes his owner's scent after 20 full years apart, without a single doubt, and quietly dies right there moments later, having stubbornly waited just long enough to see him come home one final time. Penelope, still not recognizing her own disguised husband standing in her own hall, announces one final decisive test for all the suitors crowding her home. Whoever can string Odysseus's old personal hunting bow, a bow so physically demanding that none of the suitors present has even managed to bend it an inch, and then shoot a single arrow cleanly through the aligned handles of 12 axes lined up in a row, can have her hand in marriage and the entire kingdom along with it. Every single suitor in the room tries their best. Every single one of them fails. Some of them quite humiliatingly in front of everyone, unable to flex the ancient string back, even slightly. Then the disguised old beggar sitting quietly in the corner politely asks if he might be allowed to have a turn as well. He strings the bow on his very first try, almost effortlessly, as if the weapon itself still remembers the shape of his hands after 20 years apart, and fires an arrow clean through all 12 axe handles in a single fluid motion without a single wasted movement. But what nobody expected is what happens in the following 60 seconds. Before the stunned suitors even finish processing what they just watched happen in front of them, Odysseus turns the same bow directly on them instead of the target, and with his grown son Telemachus physically barring the only exit from the hall, kills every single suitor in the room, well over 100 armed men in total, inside the very same hall where they had spent years eating his stored food and openly disrespecting his household. Here's the specific detail that makes this entire story genuinely unsettling in a completely different way than any of the monsters or gods ever could. In 1871, Heinrich Schliemann dug into that hill in Turkey called Hizarlik, and archaeologists working the same site ever since have identified at least 9 separate cities built directly on top of each other at that exact location, stretching back roughly 5,000 years of continuous human settlement. One specific layer, labeled by archaeologists as Troy 7A, was violently destroyed by fire sometime around 1180 BC, right around the traditional window when the war is supposed to have actually happened according to ancient chronology. Bronze arrowheads and sling stones were found scattered directly through the burned ruins in patterns that closely match a deliberate siege, not an earthquake or an accidental household fire. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people likely lived inside that city, more than enough population to plausibly justify a legendary multi-kingdom alliance sailing across an entire sea to attack it. Later excavations by archaeologist Manfred Korfmann in the 1990s and 2000s also uncovered a much larger lower city, extending well beyond the citadel walls Schliemann originally found, suggesting the real settlement was significantly bigger and significantly more worth fighting over than anyone initially assumed. Nobody serious is claiming a giant hollow wooden horse actually rolled through a real city gate, or that an actual one-eyed Cyclops genuinely ate real Greek sailors for dinner. But a real, violent Bronze Age destruction at exactly the right geographic location, in roughly exactly the right window of historical time, does genuinely appear to be sitting underneath a story that generations of ordinary people told out loud, from memory, for roughly 400 years before anyone ever wrote a single word of it down permanently. Somewhere in that 4-century gap between a real physical siege and a finished poem full of gods and monsters, memory quietly turned into myth, and myth eventually turned into the $250 million movie playing in theaters worldwide, right now, this very week. So here's a genuine question for you before you go. If a real war really did happen at that specific hill in Turkey, which single part of this whole story do you personally think started out as literal truth before it slowly became legend? The 10-year siege itself, the trick with the wooden horse, or the 10-year journey home afterward? Tell us your honest answer in the comments below. We genuinely want to read what you think. And if this video finally made sense of a story you've heard scattered pieces of your entire life, without ever quite knowing where any of it actually came from, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're only just getting started on the true stories, hiding quietly underneath the ones you already thought you fully knew.